January 7, 1945. The Ardennes forest buried under heavy snow. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood before assembled journalists, confident, composed, almost smiling. He spoke with the casual authority of a man who believed himself indispensable. "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. I put it into the fight. I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. I. Every sentence centred on Montgomery, as if the Battle of the Bulge had been a personal performance with himself as the solo star. 300 metres away, at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, holding the transcript of Montgomery's press conference. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from rage. Pure, barely controlled fury that his staff had never seen from the man known for diplomatic composure. 19,000 Americans were dead. 19,000. Killed in brutal winter combat during the largest battle American forces had fought in the European theatre. And Montgomery was talking about it like a cricket match he'd won through clever tactics. Eisenhower read Montgomery's words again, certain he must be misunderstanding. But no. Montgomery had actually done it. Publicly claimed credit for American blood. Minimized American sacrifice. Portrayed the United States Army as incompetent children rescued by British brilliance. The ultimatum Eisenhower drafted that day was 3 words that would determine the future of the Allied coalition. It is him or me. The relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery was toxic long before January 1945. Understanding the explosion requires understanding the fundamental incompatibility between these two men. Eisenhower was a political general. That's not an insult, it's a description of his actual role. Supreme Allied Commander wasn't primarily a battlefield position, it was a coalition management position. Eisenhower commanded British, American, Canadian, French and Polish forces with competing national interests, different tactical doctrines, and enormous egos. His job was keeping this fractious alliance together long enough to defeat Germany. He was skilled at it, patient, diplomatic, willing to compromise, focused on the bigger picture. Montgomery was the opposite, tactically brilliant, organizationally competent, personally impossible. He viewed the war as a solo performance where lesser talents supported his genius. He considered Eisenhower a strategic amateur who'd been promoted beyond his competence for political reasons. He said this openly, to anyone who would listen. Montgomery believed he should command all Allied ground forces, that Eisenhower should step aside and let the professional soldier run the actual war. This wasn't just ego. Montgomery genuinely believed he was the only Allied commander capable of defeating Germany efficiently. Everyone else was making mistakes that Montgomery wouldn't make if given proper authority. The problem was that giving Montgomery what he wanted required Eisenhower to essentially demote himself. And Washington hated Montgomery with a passion that required constant diplomatic intervention by Churchill just to keep him employed. Montgomery's self-perception was divorced from reality in ways that would be comedic if the stakes weren't so high. He believed he was indispensable, the one man who could save the Allied cause from American incompetence. Omar Bradley? Mediocre at best. George Patton? A dangerous cowboy whose reckless tactics wasted American lives. Eisenhower? A political appointment who didn't understand battlefield command. Montgomery wrote regular letters to London explaining how American generals were ruining the war, how American troops were poorly led, how the broad front strategy Eisenhower favoured was strategically bankrupt, how only Montgomery's proposed single-thrust strategy toward Berlin would work. He was relentless, and he assumed that his tactical competence made him politically untouchable. That Eisenhower wouldn't dare remove him because British public opinion and Churchill's support created a protective shield. This assumption was Montgomery's fundamental error. He confused Eisenhower's tolerance with weakness. He mistook diplomatic patience for inability to act. He thought that because Eisenhower had accepted Montgomery's behavior for months, he would continue accepting it indefinitely. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. But he wouldn't realize it until after he'd publicly humiliated the American command structure in front of the world press. December 16, 1944, changed everything. The German offensive through the Ardennes caught American forces by surprise. 400,000 German troops, with over 1,000 tanks, punched a 50-mile bulge into Allied lines, creating a wedge that split American First Army in the north from American Third Army in the south. Communications were disrupted, command structure was chaotic, the situation required immediate action. Eisenhower made a pragmatic decision. He transferred temporary command of 200,000 American troops in the northern sector to Montgomery. The logic was sound. The German offensive had severed Bradley's ability to effectively command forces on both sides of the Bulge. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was positioned to provide unified command in the north. Militarily, it made sense. Politically and psychologically, it was a disaster. Bradley was humiliated. American generals were furious. Patton was apoplectic at the idea of American forces serving under British command. But they obeyed, because Eisenhower ordered it and because the military situation demanded it. Montgomery took command and immediately made the situation worse through sheer arrogance. He showed up at American headquarters acting like he was rescuing incompetent children. He rejected American plans without discussion. He reorganized defensive lines without consulting the American commanders who'd been fighting there for days. He lectured American generals about basic tactics as if they were students. When Bradley requested a meeting to coordinate, Montgomery refused to visit Bradley's headquarters. He demanded Bradley come to him. As if Montgomery was the superior officer rather than a temporary commander of a portion of Bradley's forces. The resentment built quickly. American officers started debating among themselves whether they hated fighting Germans or fighting alongside the British more. That's how bad relations got. Montgomery stabilized the northern front. His tactical decisions were sound. The defensive positions he established held against German attacks. From a purely military perspective, his command was effective. But effectiveness measured purely in tactical terms missed the broader picture. Montgomery destroyed goodwill. He poisoned relationships that would need to function for months of continued fighting. He created resentment that festered among American commanders who would need to cooperate in future operations. He treated allies like subordinates and subordinates like incompetents, and he genuinely didn't understand why this created problems. To Montgomery, results justified methods. He'd stabilized the situation. American generals should be grateful, not resentful. The fact that they were resentful proved they were small-minded and petty. Then came January 7th and the press conference that nearly destroyed the alliance. Montgomery's description of the Battle of the Bulge was fiction. Pure mythology where Montgomery was the hero and Americans were rescued by his intervention. 19,000 American dead were mentioned almost as an afterthought. The heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne, barely acknowledged. Patton's brilliant southern counterattack that relieved the siege, minimized. The entire narrative centered on Montgomery's genius saving American forces from disaster. The British press ran with it. Headlines celebrated Montgomery as the savior of the Americans. Radio broadcasts praised British competence rescuing American chaos. The narrative spread across Britain. Montgomery had once again proven that British military expertise exceeded American enthusiasm. In the United States, the reaction was explosive. Bradley threatened to resign, not bluff, actual resignation. He told Eisenhower directly that he would not continue serving under conditions where Montgomery received credit for American blood. Patton demanded immediate freedom to launch offensive operations without British interference. Other American commanders submitted formal protests about Montgomery's characterization of American performance. The American military command structure was in open revolt, not against German forces, against the British. Eisenhower faced a crisis that threatened to fracture the alliance at the moment when unity was most critical. Germany was retreating but not defeated. Months of hard fighting remained. The coalition needed to hold together through final offensives and occupation of Germany. Instead, it was tearing itself apart over Montgomery's ego. Eisenhower made his decision. He drafted a cable to General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, explaining the situation with brutal clarity. The cable laid out Montgomery's behavior, the damage to Allied relations, and Eisenhower's conclusion: Montgomery had to go. And if Washington wouldn't remove Montgomery, then Eisenhower would resign. It is him or me. 3 words that crystallized the crisis. Not a negotiation, an ultimatum. This wasn't political theater. Eisenhower was prepared to actually resign. His cable to Marshall made that clear. He'd tolerated Montgomery's behavior because tactical competence was valuable and maintaining coalition unity was paramount. But Montgomery's press conference crossed a line. It wasn't just insulting, it was strategically dangerous. It undermined American public support for the war. It damaged morale among troops who'd bled in the Ardennes. It threatened future cooperation between Allied forces. No amount of tactical brilliance justified that damage. Eisenhower understood something Montgomery didn't. The war was as much political as military. Yes, battles had to be won, but the coalition had to survive. Public opinion had to be maintained. Soldiers had to believe their sacrifices mattered and were recognized. Montgomery's press conference damaged all of that, and Eisenhower was done tolerating it. Montgomery's chief of staff, Freddie de Guingand, was dispatched to deliver the news. He arrived at Montgomery's headquarters and explained the situation. Eisenhower was on the verge of either firing Montgomery or resigning himself. Washington was prepared to support Eisenhower. Churchill couldn't save Montgomery this time because the political situation was too explosive. Montgomery initially laughed, literally laughed. He didn't believe Eisenhower would actually do it. He thought it was political posturing, an attempt to scare him into better behavior. De Guingand had to explain reality. Eisenhower was serious. The order was drafted. All that remained was transmission to Marshall and formal execution. Montgomery was hours away from being relieved of command in the middle of the largest battle of the Western Front. Reality hit Montgomery hard. He'd fundamentally miscalculated the power dynamics of 1945. In 1942, when Montgomery took command in North Africa, Britain was the senior partner in the Western Alliance. British forces outnumbered Americans. British experience exceeded American. British equipment and logistics were more developed. Montgomery's attitude made sense in that context. But by January 1945, everything had changed. The numbers were overwhelming. The United States was providing 80% of the men fighting in Western Europe, 90% of the equipment, nearly all of the oil and fuel. American production had become the foundation of Allied military capability. Britain's contribution, while still significant, was dwarfed by American resources. Montgomery was operating with a 1942 mindset in a 1945 reality. He failed to recognize that the balance of power had shifted decisively. America wasn't the junior partner anymore. Britain was. Eisenhower wasn't just a military commander. He was the most powerful man in the Western world. He commanded resources that exceeded anything Britain could provide. He had political backing from Washington that made him essentially untouchable. And he'd reached the limit of his tolerance for Montgomery's behavior. Montgomery faced a choice: apologize and submit, or be fired and spend the rest of the war in disgrace. There was no third option where his tactical brilliance saved him. The politics were too clear. America was too powerful. Eisenhower was too determined. Montgomery chose survival. He wrote a personal letter to Eisenhower, handwritten, not typed through official channels, personal communication from one commander to another. The letter was a complete surrender. Montgomery acknowledged Eisenhower's authority without reservation. He apologized for his behavior. He promised complete cooperation going forward. He expressed regret for damage to Allied relations. He pledged to subordinate his own views to Eisenhower's strategic direction. It was everything Eisenhower had wanted to hear for months: total capitulation, unconditional surrender of Montgomery's ego to Eisenhower's command authority. Eisenhower accepted the apology. Publicly, the crisis was resolved. The alliance maintained its facade of unity. Montgomery remained in command of 21st Army Group. Operations continued, but privately, nothing was resolved. Eisenhower kept the draft firing order. He filed it away as a reminder and a warning. If Montgomery stepped out of line again, the order would be sent immediately. No second chances, no further tolerance. The relationship was broken beyond repair. From January 1945 forward, Eisenhower increasingly favored American commanders in strategic decisions. Bradley became the primary ground commander for U.S. forces. Montgomery's role was constrained to his own sector. His influence on overall strategy diminished. He was tolerated but not trusted, effective but isolated, tactically competent but strategically irrelevant. The geopolitical significance of the crisis extended far beyond personal conflict between two generals. This was the moment when Britain's imperial decline became visible in military command structure. Montgomery represented the old order, British strategic dominance, British military experience as the foundation of Allied operations, British generals as natural leaders of coalition warfare. All of that was ending. The future belonged to American power, American resources, American commanders. The transition was inevitable given the massive disparity in resources, but Montgomery's humiliation made it visible and undeniable. Churchill understood this. In private communications, he acknowledged that Eisenhower's ultimatum was a watershed moment. Britain could no longer dictate terms to America. The Atlantic Alliance was becoming an American-led coalition with Britain as a valued but subordinate partner. That transformation hurt British pride, but the mathematics were inescapable. America had the men, the equipment, the industrial capacity, and the political will. Britain had experience and determination, but lacked the raw power to compete. The post-war world would be shaped by American and Soviet power. Britain would be important, but secondary. Montgomery's crisis with Eisenhower was a preview of that future, and Montgomery's surrender to Eisenhower symbolized Britain's broader recognition of changed realities. The most dangerous battle of the Bulge wasn't fought with rifles and tanks. It was fought with words and political power in headquarters hundreds of miles from the front lines. Montgomery won tactical victories on the battlefield. He stabilized defensive positions. He prevented German breakthrough. He organized counterattacks that pushed German forces back. All of that is historically accurate. But he lost the political battle catastrophically. His press conference destroyed trust that would never be rebuilt. His arrogance alienated allies whose cooperation was essential. His failure to recognize changed power dynamics nearly cost him his command, and ultimately, his ego proved more dangerous to the alliance than German offensive operations. Eisenhower's victory was more important than any battlefield success. He established definitively that no individual commander was bigger than the alliance, that political unity mattered as much as tactical brilliance, that American forces would not be subordinated to British command permanently regardless of individual competence, that respect and cooperation were non-negotiable requirements for coalition warfare. Montgomery learned these lessons the hard way, but he learned them. After January 1945, his behavior changed noticeably. He was more cooperative, less publicly critical, more willing to subordinate personal views to Eisenhower's strategic direction. The transformation wasn't complete. Montgomery's ego was too large for complete humility, but it was sufficient. He functioned effectively within the command structure for the remainder of the war. The 19,000 Americans who died in the Battle of the Bulge deserved better than being props in Montgomery's self-promotional mythology. They fought in brutal winter conditions against overwhelming German attacks. They held positions that military doctrine said were indefensible. They died buying time for reinforcements and counterattacks. Their sacrifice made possible the eventual Allied victory in the Ardennes. Montgomery's press conference trivialized that sacrifice. He turned their deaths into background noise for his own performance. That's what infuriated Eisenhower more than anything. Not the personal slight to American commanders, not the political damage to the alliance, but the disrespect to soldiers who'd bled and died. Eisenhower understood what Montgomery apparently didn't. Command is ultimately about the soldiers. Their lives matter, their sacrifices matter, their recognition matters. A commander who treats soldiers as expendable resources for personal glory has failed at the most fundamental level of leadership. Montgomery's tactical competence couldn't compensate for that moral failure. Eisenhower's ultimatum was as much about defending the dignity of American soldiers as about asserting command authority. The message was clear. These men died as American soldiers in American units under American command. Their sacrifice would be recognized appropriately, not minimized, not appropriated, not transformed into British propaganda. Montgomery remained a British hero. In Britain's public imagination, he was the brilliant general who'd won at El Alamein, led the march through Italy, commanded at D-Day, and saved the Americans at the Bulge. That mythology was never fully dispelled. British public opinion celebrated Montgomery until his death in 1976. But within Allied command, Montgomery's influence died in January 1945. He commanded 21st Army Group competently through the final months of war. He led British forces across the Rhine. He accepted German surrender in northern Germany. He performed his duties well, but he was never again consulted on overall Allied strategy. He never again had the ear of supreme command. He never again held the kind of influence he'd wielded in earlier years. Eisenhower had broken him politically without relieving him militarily. Montgomery kept his command but lost his power. That was Eisenhower's genius. He didn't create a public crisis that would fracture the alliance. He simply removed Montgomery's ability to influence decisions beyond his immediate command. The result was optimal from Eisenhower's perspective. Montgomery remained useful tactically while being neutralized politically. The lessons from January 1945 transcend World War II and remain relevant to modern coalition warfare. First, tactical brilliance is insufficient without respect for allies and subordinates. Montgomery was tactically competent but relationally catastrophic. His inability to maintain working relationships limited his effectiveness regardless of military skill. Second, political considerations are as important as military ones in coalition operations. Eisenhower understood this. Montgomery never did. The general who manages coalition politics successfully has more impact than the general who wins battles while destroying alliances. Third, power dynamics matter. Montgomery failed to recognize that American dominance had made British commanders subordinate regardless of individual competence. That misreading of power almost cost him everything. Fourth, no individual is indispensable. Montgomery believed he was too important to be removed. Eisenhower proved otherwise. The war would continue with or without Montgomery. The alliance would survive. American forces would fight effectively. Montgomery's presence was valuable, but not essential. Fifth, ego is the enemy of effective command. Montgomery's need for recognition and credit destroyed relationships and nearly destroyed his career. Eisenhower's willingness to subordinate ego to mission made him successful where Montgomery failed. The moment when Eisenhower held Montgomery's press conference transcript and made the decision to issue an ultimatum was pivotal. Not just for the two men involved, not just for the Allied command structure, but for the broader trajectory of post-war international relations. In that moment, Eisenhower established that American power would shape the post-war world, that American military and political leadership would define Western strategy, that British influence, while valued, would be secondary to American direction. Churchill recognized this shift and accepted it because he had no choice. British power was insufficient to challenge American dominance. The Atlantic Alliance would continue, but on American terms. Montgomery's humiliation symbolized Britain's broader loss of primacy. The empire that had dominated global affairs for centuries was giving way to American hegemony. That transition was already underway, but January 1945 made it visible and undeniable. The old British Field Marshal subordinating himself to the American general was a preview of post-war reality. Eisenhower never publicly gloated about his victory over Montgomery. He maintained the diplomatic facade that the crisis was resolved amicably and that Allied unity remained strong. Privately, he understood what had happened. He'd established command authority definitively. He'd protected American soldiers' dignity. He'd demonstrated that political skill could triumph over tactical arrogance, and he'd set precedents that would govern Allied cooperation for the remainder of the war and beyond. When the war ended, Eisenhower returned to America as a hero. He became Army Chief of Staff, then President of Columbia University, then Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO, then President of the United States. His career trajectory took him to the highest levels of military and political power. Montgomery returned to Britain as a hero, but increasingly became a historical figure rather than a contemporary leader. He commanded British occupation forces in Germany, then became Chief of the Imperial General Staff, then Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe under Eisenhower at NATO, a position that must have been particularly galling given their history. He lived until 1976, long enough to see the world he'd known disappear. The British Empire dissolved. American power dominated the West. The war he'd fought became history studied by new generations who knew him primarily through books and documentaries rather than contemporary events. The final assessment of Montgomery is complex. He was tactically brilliant. His victories at El Alamein and in Normandy were real and significant. His organizational skills were exceptional. His ability to prepare forces for complex operations exceeded most contemporaries. But his character flaws limited his effectiveness and nearly destroyed his career. His arrogance alienated allies whose cooperation was essential. His need for recognition damaged relationships that could have amplified his influence. His failure to recognize political realities made him vulnerable when those realities shifted. Eisenhower's assessment was more straightforward. Montgomery was a competent tactical commander whose ego required constant management, useful when controlled, dangerous when allowed freedom, ultimately subordinate to political and strategic considerations that Montgomery never fully understood. The ultimatum of January 1945 was Eisenhower's final effort to control Montgomery. It worked. Montgomery submitted. The alliance survived. The war continued. And the balance of power in the Western world shifted decisively from Britain to America. All because one general believed he was bigger than the war, and another general proved him wrong. 3 words defined the crisis and resolved it. It is him or me. Not a negotiation, not a compromise. An ultimatum that forced choice and established authority. Montgomery chose survival. He surrendered his ego. He accepted subordination. He recognized finally that brilliance without humility leads to isolation and irrelevance. Eisenhower accepted the surrender but never forgot the crisis. The draft firing order remained filed as a reminder. Trust, once broken, is never fully restored. They worked together for the remainder of the war. They cooperated in post-war NATO, but the relationship was professional, not personal, respectful but distant, effective but cold. That was sufficient. The mission didn't require friendship. It required competence and cooperation. Montgomery provided both after January 1945. Because Eisenhower had made clear what happened to commanders who prioritized ego over mission. They were removed, regardless of talent, regardless of reputation, regardless of national origin or political protection. The war was bigger than any individual. The alliance was more important than any ego. 19,000 American dead deserved better than serving as props in Montgomery's mythology, and Eisenhower made damn sure they got it.